Thank you, everybody. Wow, it's nice to see so many people joining me at the lunch hour. Nice to see some familiar names. Hello. And my name is Scott Pearson, and I'm a research scientist with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, where I've worked for over 20 years. And in addition to being a research scientist, I also supervise our West Side research team, so a team of researchers and a veterinarian and biologists. And I do find some time to do my own research, which is wonderful, and to participate in other people's research. And let's see if I can get it for this. Oh, there we go. It's progressing. As I'm talking today, I'll use maybe I sometimes. That might be appropriate, but a lot of times I really mean we. And I work with a lot of different partners, and those are federal partners and tribal partners and nonprofits, and some of those people in academics, and some of those people I've been working with for a very long time, and some of them are relatively new partners. But I just want to emphasize, without all of these partners and all the work I'm going to be talking about today, it really would not have been possible. So I just want to emphasize that. So today I'm going to be talking about three auks and about how they're similar and different in many different ways. And when we talk about auks, I always think about the great auk. The great auk went extinct in the 1850s as a result of human harvest. And it was sort of a quintessential auk. It was a very big bird, and it was a flightless bird, but which actually makes it kind of unusual. All the other extant auks today all can fly. Superficially, they look like penguins, tend to have that black and white coloration, black towards the back and white towards the bottom. That coloration may help in terms of finding prey and being invisible to prey, and also may help them avoid predation. And even though they look a lot like a penguin, they're not related at all. Well, they're related to penguins, of course, they're birds, but they're not very closely related to penguins. And it's just an example of convergent evolution, where the auks have a very similar look. In addition, the other similarity to penguins is when they go underwater in pursuit of prey, they fly underwater. And so they fly underwater, and there's a big trade-off for alcids or auks in terms of being able to fly underwater in pursuit of prey and be able to fly in the air. As a result, people may not think of them as very graceful flyers. They can fly very fast and often in a straight line, but they're not super maneuverable in terms of bird flight. I'm going to talk about these three auks, and let me just, when I'm talking about the auks, I'm talking about the Alcidae family. So a family of birds, and in that family we find the razorbills, the murres, the murrelets, the guillemots, the auklets, and the puffins. And I'm going to talk about three members of this family. I'm going to talk about the marbled murrelet, which you see pictured at the top right. I'm going to talk about the Rhinoceros Auklet middle, which has that very obvious bump on its beak, which some people call a horn. And I'm also going to talk about the Tufted Puffin. And when you look at the taxonomy here, or the genetic relationships here, you can see that the Rhinoceros Auklet is misnamed. And it's really not an auklet. It's a puffin, and it should have been named the Rhinoceros puffin. It's the most basal member of the puffin clade, and so as a result, tufted puffins and Rhinoceros auklets are much more closely related than they are to a marbled murrelet. Now there are a whole bunch of other, or there are several other members of this family that we see in the Puget Sound region, and the most common and ubiquitous one is this one, the pigeon guillemot. People love it. They see it on their shoreline, they see it on the docks and beaches around them, where it breeds on islands like Whidbey and Anderson and all kinds of places, and tends to have a very near shore diet, like you see the sculpin being brought in, or this snake prickleback being brought to a chick. We also have some other ones that a lot of people probably have never seen. So we have Cassin's auklets. Cassin's auklets are found just on the outer coast of Washington. I rarely see them in the inner marine waters. I might see them at the western end of the straits. Although last winter, while we were out capturing marbled murrelets in the middle of the night, I did see one of these. which was really unusual, but it was after a pretty big storm event on the outer coast, which probably brought it into Port Townsend Bay. And I should say there are thousands of them on the outer coast. They're actually, some of the colonies have thousands of Cassin's auklets. It's a very hard bird to get a picture of. So I apologize for the very small image taken on a pelagic trip at one point. Another common bird that we see in the same family is the common murre. And the common murre breeds in Washington, essentially from Cape Flattery, the Touche Island, south to Point Grenville. And it really tends to be found in our intermarine waters, primarily during the non-breeding season. And also during the breeding season, we've seen more of them in years in the intermarine waters when they don't reproduce well, so they fail to breed or decide not to breed due to poor conditions. And this is what one looks like on the water. This time of year, I'm seeing many dozens to hundreds of these. I've been out the past week, going out tomorrow night to capture marble murrelets in the water. When we're out, we encounter way more of these than we do marble murrelets. Sometimes many dozens of these ancient murrelets. Ancient murrelets breed to the north of us. The center of gravity for them, if you will, is the Haida region of Canada. But we have growing evidence that they're actually nesting in Washington now. So I'm becoming more and more convinced that we actually have nesting ancient murrelets on the outer coast of Washington, which is pretty exciting. We also get visitors in this family. So we get horned puffins. Horned puffins I've seen frequently in the Strait of Juan de Fuca in the non-breeding season. And then recently, over the past 5 years or so, we've had one visiting Smith Island. And then on the outer coast of Washington, when you're far out at sea, you might see a Scripsis murrelet also in this family. So there are other members of this family we do see. So this one, I probably took this picture 30 miles offshore on the outer coast of Washington. So let's go focus on those three auks or alcids, starting with the Rhinoceros Auklet. In terms of its range-wide breeding, it's found from Japan all the way through Russia, through the Aleutians, and then all the way down the coast of North America, down into California. And it winters somewhere out in the Pacific, and I'll provide a little more information on that in a minute. In terms of its main breeding colonies in the world, it's these. And I mean in the world. These are the largest colonies in the world for the species. Most of those found in Haida and the Scott Islands to the north of us. But we happen to have one that's very important colony for the Rhinoceros Auklet, and that's Protection Island, where we have 35,000 nesting pairs, based on our last estimate. It tends to be a near shore in terms of its distribution. So this is a hot and cold map on the right, and hot colors meaning more of them and cold meaning fewer. And you can see the hot showing up particularly near colonies on the outer coast of Washington, cold indicating where we don't see very many. And so they tend to be near their colonies in the breeding season, and they tend to be foraging in that area as well. The same is true in the Salish Sea. The recent work by Liam, who I think is on this call, and then also Sarah Converse, suggests that the ones at Protection Island will forage all the way up along the coast of Vancouver Island. They'll go over by Dungeness Spit. They also go into Admiralty Inlet. So they do venture a ways. They are burrow nesters, so they dig a burrow into the ground, as you see here. And they do that with their beak and their feet. And as I mentioned, there is a very important colony in Washington, that's Protection Island. So I'm on the slopes of Protection here, looking towards Discovery Bay. And if I look down slope, I would see all these holes that Peter took a picture of here. And it's just riddled with holes, the island. And so where did they go in the winter? We participated in a study with Mark Hipfner and his partners. And so we assembled data from the Gulf of Alaska all the way down through Haida and to the Scott Islands, and then eventually all the way down to Protection and Destruction, and all the way down to California. And we put on these geolocator tags and looked at where they went. And we found that the Rhinoceros auklets from Protection Island tended to go mostly offshore. And some of them went quite far north, all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska. And some of them went quite far south, all the way down into California. Destruction Island birds, interestingly, only went south, really towards California, much more similar to what we see in the Farallon Islands and Año Nuevo. So let's look at tufted puffin in terms of its distribution and where you find it. It breeds from Japan all the way through Russia, Alaska, British Columbia, all the way down to California. So similar to what we saw with the rhinoceros auklet. But this, rather than the center of gravity being what like we saw for the rhinoceros auklet was over here, it's really right here for the tufted puffin. So it's in the Aleutians, and it's in islands like Iktak, where you have hundreds of thousands of nesting rhinoceros auklets on that island. And when you're actually on that island, as I was recently, well, actually it was a couple years ago, and you look up into the sky, you just see a swarm of tufted puffins. Every bird in that image, all those little dots, are tufted puffins going to and from the colony. And when you're on the colony, they're huge, and they're just covered with puffins. Spectacular, just truly amazing to see sites like this. And then in Washington, unfortunately, our colonies are very small, fraction of what we just saw there, a very small fraction. And we've lost over half of them. So if we look at where they used to breed and where they are today, we can see where they used to breed are the yellow colonies, and those are no longer occupied. And we can see where they currently breed, which are the blue colonies. And we hope to repeat the survey. I did this a number of years ago with a variety of partners, and see whether or not we've lost any more colonies. But you can see we lost all of our tufted puffins from the Salmon Archipelago, and we've also lost a number of colonies from the northern coast of Washington. It's hard to see because they're a little bit behind the blue, but we've lost about half. There are two remaining in the intermarine waters, Smith Island and Protection Island. And last year, we only noticed one nesting pair. We found only one active burrow for tufted puffins on Protection Island. So Protection Island is very close to blinking out. Tufted puffins, like the rhinoceros auklet, dig burrows into the soil. And I happened to catch this bird in the middle of the act on Jagged Island on the outer coast of Washington. And this bird was carrying out large rocks out of the burrow. And it was in there. And when it gets in there, it cuts away at the front of that burrow with that beak. And then it kicks all the dirt out. And when you're standing outside the burrow, when they're kicking the dirt out, you just see this cloud of dirt coming out of the hole. And they have incredibly sharp claws, both the tufted puffin and the rhinoceros auklet. I can tell you from experience that they've done a good job of ripping my flesh. And those claws are nice and sharp. In terms of their use of the habitat, they are a little bit different than what we saw at the rhinoceros auklet, where they tend to use both the near shore, very close to their burrows, and the colonies, but they also go far offshore, all the way out to the shelf break. So this bird is going back and forth. Some are foraging in the near shore, some are foraging in the offshore. And then, of course, they're finding food for both themselves and for their chicks. And then during the non-breeding season, they look like this. This is an adult, it's not a juvenile. You notice that mantle or that shield on its beak has been lost. It's lost most of that white face patch, and it's lost the tuft. It'll grow that back again in the next breeding season. I'm about 15 miles offshore when I took this picture in late October, maybe November. I'm trying to remember what time of year it was, about that time of year when I took this picture. And this is what they look like in the non-breeding season. And people rarely see them looking like this. You tend to see them in their full breeding plumage. Then there's the marbled murrelet, the third member of this group, and they breed primarily in North America, from mostly the Gulf of Alaska all the way down into California, and are very near shore in terms of their distribution, both during the breeding and non-breeding season. Excuse me. And there's certain hotspots where we see a lot of them. So if you look at the hotspots where we find them south of the Canadian border, we do find some hotspots up in the San Juan Archipelago, some warm spots over by Port Townsend and Admiralty Inlet, some hotspots along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, some warm and hot places along the north coast of Washington, a very hot region off the central coast of Oregon, particularly off the Sayusla National Forest, and then again, another very hot spot along the northern California coast. And this is an unusual bird because they breed inland in forests. Almost all seabirds breed on offshore islands and rocks or on the shoreline area. This is an odd bird, and it flies inland into these forests. And this is modeled habitat. So this is our most recent model. It hasn't been released yet. But this is what the habitat looks like and where you find it. And you tend to be found primarily in old forests and national parks and national forests and some DNR land, mostly absent from private land. And the odd thing about this bird is it nests on branches on very large diameter trees. So those trees can be the diameter of the branch can be incredibly large. And on top of that, you have this moss layer, and then they create a depression in that moss layer where they'll lay a single egg. And then they incubate that egg. You can see the bird here. And then this is what the nest looks like after the chicks fledge, where you see this fecal ring around the outside. So the bird sits in the middle and poops around the outside edge, and it creates that sort of fecal ring you see here. We've been looking at the distribution in Puget Sound thanks to the Navy. So we had Navy funding to look at the non-breeding distribution in habitat use and also trends in their population over time. And we've been focused on these areas, sort of the Admiralty Inlet area here, the Stratum 2, the Whidbey Basin, I'm calling this area over here, North Hood Canal, and then I'm calling this Central Puget Sound. And what's interesting about that is that we find that places like Central Puget Sound essentially have no birds, regardless of whether I'm looking at September, October, November, December, January, February, or March, or April. Notice that Strata 5 has almost no birds. They're birds. You can see a little wiggle to these dots, but that means we're almost detecting very close to zero. And then there are places like Admiralty Inlet here, and you notice in all seasons, there are quite a few birds. So it's a place where we tend to find them pretty consistently. That's one of those warm spots I showed you on that previous map. And then Hood Canal and Whidbey Basin are kind of interesting. And in Hood Canal and Whidbey Basin, we tend to see them coming in the September, October, and in November, December. And then their number tends to drop in January, February, and March and April as they start to go into breeding season, suggesting this habitat is used more seasonally. And our long-term data suggests that the population during the winter is declining. In terms of the distribution patterns, summarizing what I just talked about, marble murrelets use a nearshore habitat year-round. Tufted puffins use an offshore environment in the winter, so they're very pelagic. They will use both a nearshore and offshore environment during the breeding season. And the rhino is reverse of the puffin, where it uses a nearshore and offshore environment during the winter and uses the nearshore environment almost exclusively during the breeding season. So in terms of the nest habitat, the marble murrelet is the odd bird. And you notice here it uses older forests and it uses tree branches. Tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets are both found on rocks and islands. They have to have soil, and they nest in burrows. I take it back. They don't have to have soil. In Washington, they only use burrows that they've dug into soil. We've never seen a crevice nest. But if you go down to the Farallon Islands in California, almost all the nests down there are actually crevice nests. So crevice in rocks, where you've got a jumble of rocks, they can be in a crevice in there. So let's move on and talk a little bit about diet of these three and talk about reproduction and chick provisioning. And one thing I forgot to say is I'm trying to make sure, I hope I credited people appropriately where I use other people's pictures. If it's uncredited, that means I took the picture. So just wanted to make sure that's clear. And so I think it's important, particularly when you're using other people's pictures, that you make sure to credit people appropriately. So I just wanted to point that out. So again. So in terms of phenology and reproduction of these two, the marble murrelet starts breeding the earliest in late April, but probably most of them don't start really breeding until May and June, much more like what you see in tufted puffins and rhinoceros auklets. All three species only lay one egg, and they tend to only have one clutch. So it's a one-time occurrence per year. They tend to have very long incubation periods and chick provisioning periods. So over a month for the auklets and the puffins. So a long period of both incubating that egg first, where they're changing the guard every 24 hours, and then provisioning that chick throughout the day. And the same thing is occurring here, but over a shorter period of time, closer to a month or a little less than a month. When do they start breeding? Well, we really don't know, hence all these question marks. People publish it and say, probably about this. This is what we think, and that's mainly based on work on other members of this family. We really don't know, but probably around 3 years. So that means once it leaves any of these three species leaves the nest site and goes out to the ocean, they don't touch land for 3 years, and then they come back to the land for their first time. So in terms of the diet composition, how do we get at that? And it can be tough. And fortunately, a number of tools that help us. So we use sort of old-fashioned approaches, and we use newer approaches. All three of these species, when they feed their chicks, are what we call bill load provisioners. So they're carrying fish crosswise in their beak, and that can be one to many fish. The murrelet's a little bit different, and it only carries one fish at a time. And then they're coming back to their burrow. In this case, this is a rhinoceros auklet chick in my hand that Peter took a picture of. And this was in a nest box on Protection Island. This chick successfully fledged. And they're bringing back bill loads to feed this chick. And this chick is in there just growing like mad. And each adult, for example, on the rhinoceros auklet, might be bringing a 30-gram bill load. So this chick could be getting 60 grams of fish per night. It's a lot of fish considering the weight of this chick. And they're just sitting in there growing like mad. They go from this downy state to being fully feathered by the time they actually fledge. And what's interesting about these is they're different in terms of how they visit their colonies. Rhinoceros auklets come in at night with that bill load. So this is taken in the middle of the night. They tend to start coming in at 10:30 or 11 p.m. And then they tend to be active on the colony until around 4 a.m. So it's that nighttime window when they're on the colony and they come in and feed the chicks, or where they switch in terms of who's incubating the egg. And then what we can do, and we've done this very successfully, and we do it in a very low impact way. We do collect some bill loads. All the chicks are successful, at least that we're aware of, in terms of the bill loads we have stolen. And we're very careful not to steal more than one bill load per year per pair, or at least we try it very hard not to. And then we can measure that bill load and get the calories, we can get the fish composition. We can also contribute that sample to other studies to understand, for example, do the herring, are they unhealthy or are they healthy herring, based on some other work that other people are doing. And then we can also look at trends in diet over time. On Protection Island, looking at the rhino diet, this is what's being fed to chicks. It's herring and sand lance. It's a herring and sand lance story since I started doing this work in 2006 to today. And the ratio of herring and sand lance changes. And every so often we get other things, and we get salmon. For example, the red bars come in, and that's primarily chum and pink. But we also occasionally get anchovy and smelts as well. There's actually a whole list of other species that come back, everything from lamprey to sticklebacks to all kinds of other things. But those things are all relatively rare. This is the bread and butter, and it's primarily a herring and salmon story. You go to the outer coast, it becomes really different. So we're talking about the same species on the other outer coast on Destruction Island. And you can see there, it was anchovy for a long time. That's that bright yellow. I notice it kind of goes away. And it appeared that transition occurred about when the big marine heat wave hit us in 2014, 15, 16. And it was right after that, there seemed to be really a big regime change in terms of the diet. And that's where it seemed to switch more to a herring, smelt, sand lance diet. Rockfish are kind of sporadic. They come in and out of the diet, depending on how many juvenile rockfish are being produced. So they're even very small juvenile rockfish. Where puffins are hard. And the reason puffins are hard is that they're very sensitive to human disturbance. So one thing we can do is we can observe and take pictures of the bill load as it's coming into the colony. So here's Peter Odom looking up at a bird, and as they're coming in, we can take pictures. This is actually a picture I took in the Aleutians, but gives you an idea of a bill load coming in, and I can count how many fish are in that beak, and I can determine what fish are in that beak. And I can compare the fish to the size of the beak. Here's a bird coming into Destruction Island. Here's a single fish bill load. And then sometimes we actually get years where we see a lot of larval fish. And you can see how you can see through those fish. So they don't really have the scales, and you can see right through them. And so as a result, we can't tell often what species it is. We can just say it's a larval fish. And then we had an undergraduate project working with Peter, and then we were able to take all those pictures and bring them together. They're also doing that in Oregon at Haystack Rock. And we can start looking at the diet composition, at least what's being fed to chicks. And then the next few slides belong to Tom Good, who's working with us on this project. And so the joke is Tom's, but Tom started digging through the literature and wanted to see about other approaches to getting at the diet. And one fact he realized was that everybody poops. And so after consulting the literature and realizing everybody poops, you realize what goes into your mouth and then comes out the other end. We can learn about what went into the mouth. And that's a result of the tissues going through the GI tract coming out the other end. We're doing that now with harbor seals and a variety of other species. I'm doing marble murrelets, and we did it with tufted puffins. And so we can do metabarcoding. And so we're, in this case, this image is from a paper we just recently published. And we will first of all wanted to make sure, did we have the right burrow? Was it tufted puffin? Because there were a number of gulls breeding nearby. This is on the outer coast of Washington and Destruction Island. And then we can look at, okay, what was it actually eating down here? And we can see it's eating smelts, and it's eating, sorry, all the names are scientific names, but we see herring, we see night smelt, we see a variety of different species coming in this way. And then we can do comparisons both between fecal DNA, soil DNA from the puffin, compared to that what we've seen from the pictures. And then we can also look at from the same island, how does that compare to rhinoceros auklets? And we do find some consistency across where things like smelt, sandlets, herring, salmonids, flatfish, rockfish, and squid tend to be consistent dietary items. Although I should point out, for example, things like smelt and herring tend to be in high abundance, probably, based on what we're seeing, whereas things like salmonids tend to be in very low abundance. So even though they're consistently in a diet, they tend to be a low component. We're also doing a whole bunch of work right now as a result of a US Navy funded study. I'm actually going to be out on this tomorrow night. There are people at this very moment doing the trawl work, which you see here in the hydroacoustics you see on this picture. They're actually right now in Oak Bay. And I mean, literally right now, there are 2 boats out there right now doing this work. And we're going out at night. So I'm part of the nighttime team. And we're going out after dark, so we'll be out there tomorrow night and trying to capture a bird like you see that Kelly's holding. That's that marble murrelet, trying to get a fecal sample and trying to understand more about what it's eating. And then the hydroacoustics and the trawl gives us information about what's available in areas where we find the murrelet. What are we finding in terms of the diet so far? We're finding during the breeding season, they're eating Pacific sandlets and Pacific herring. And during the non-breeding season, they're eating Pacific herring, krill, smelt, salmon, pricklebacks, and sculpin. And so here's a paper that came out a little while ago that we contributed to, and you can see these are the Washington samples, and this is the non-breeding season, and these are adults, so this would be adult diet. And we can see that they're eating Pacific herring, sandlets, whitebait smelt, North Pacific krill, squid, and just krill generically. And then the other thing we did is we compared the diet for marble murrelets between what we're seeing in Washington. How does it compare to Oregon and California? And so this diagram shows that overlap, where we're seeing some overlap, and Washington overlaps with Oregon, but really doesn't overlap with California, with the exception of herring. And that's not surprising. Fish composition and abundance is going to change spatially, and you would expect as you get down to California that composition would change, and as a result, diet should change. That's why it's really a bad idea to think that diet of an animal, particularly a predator that eats a lot of different prey, is going to be the same one place as another, and particularly also at a different time as another. And in terms of what we're learning, summary here, all 3 of these are bill-load provisioners. So they're bringing back that food crosswise in their beak. The big difference here is that the marble murrelet only bring back 1, whereas the tufted puffin and rhinoceros auklet, although occasionally they do bring 1, if they do bring 1, it's going to be a big fish. It's going to be over 30 grams. That's a pretty big, for a puffin, that's a big fish if it's 35 to 40 grams. Sorry, I just don't think in ounces, so I can't I wish I could give you a conversion quickly. Maybe someone will do it in the chat on the side. But the puffins and the rhinos can give you one-to-many fish in that bill load. And that there can be over 20 fish in a bill load. And we've had 26, 27 fish in a bill load. Those tend to be things like sand lance, all stacked up in the beak. Just truly amazing they can do that. What's interesting in terms of composition is there's a great deal of overlap in terms of diet composition between these three species. That would suggest to me that it's not exactly what they're eating that might be causing population changes in these. It may not be just that, it may be other factors. There are also morphological and physical traits that are different between these. I'm not going to really go into that today. I just want to point that out. It's an important part of, should be of this talk. We just don't have time today. For example, and a notable example would be, is the tufted puffin is really big. The Rhinoceros Auklet's a little bit smaller. And the marble murrelet is less than half the size of the tufted puffin. So there are certain considerable differences among these species in terms of their morphology and physical traits. So let's talk a little bit about status and trends of these three species. I was contracted to do a range-wide assessment of tufted puffins. We published that work. We combined data from 11 data sets from the Aleutians all the way down to California. And what we really found is that in the Gulf of Alaska and the California Current, the tufted puffin populations are declining. And in the Aleutians, they seem to be stable. And remember, this is where the vast majority. So we had declines here and we had declines here. These were quite dramatic. These were not as dramatic. And these tended to be stable up here in the Aleutians. And here we're looking at just Washington. And you can see that change over time. And that change has been going on for a long period of time. But also, it's hard to see this insert, but there are a whole bunch of, these are all the breeding colonies over here. And there are a couple colonies that are quite large, and they tend to be on the outer coast of Washington. So here's Jagged, here's Carroll, and here's Alexander. And those are the three most important colonies for tufted puffins in Washington today. We'll see three. So in terms of their status and trends, how are they doing? Looking at the marble murrelet next. Marble murrelet has been doing poorly in Washington. So dramatic declines in the Salish Sea, that's what I'm showing here. So this is the US portion of the Salish Sea, Puget Sound and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And we can see a dramatic decline of 4.64% per year for this species. And I started participating in this work here and with this dot. And you can see that when this started here, the population has declined by over half. In terms of what's in Puget Sound. And I've really noticed that when I go out now, I encounter a lot fewer marble murrelets than I used to. And the same is true on the Washington coast. Again, a significant decline on the Washington coast. When you get down to Oregon, it's really different. There we're seeing actually significant increases. Remember that hot spot off of Oregon? And it's kind of in that area. And then also increases in Northern California. We don't know if they're increasing down there because they're moving from here. And if that's true, is that because it's a push or a pull? By pull, I mean, is there really good food down there? And so you're going down there, so there's more anchovy? Or is it a push? Things are really bad here. Or is it a combination of factors? And we don't have great answers yet. So how is the Rhinoceros Auklet doing? It's actually been fairly stable. I need to update this graph. I will be in the next couple of days. I didn't have time to do it prior to this talk. But in general, they've gone up and down a bit, but relatively stable over time. And we'll also have new estimates for Protection Island very shortly. So we'll have some new data coming very soon for rhinos. Keep track of time. In terms of status and trends, then the summary is marble murrelet and tufted puffins are doing really badly in Washington. Marble murrelet is listed in both places, federally and by the state. The tufted puffin is only listed by the state and not federally. That's mainly because of that stable population where the majority of the tufted puffins are in the Aleutians. And we have declines, long-term declines in Washington, and particularly in the Salish Sea. And Rhinoceros auklets appear to be stable. So when we list something, either at the state level or the federal level, we try to come up with, understand what's threatening their populations and what we can do about it. And so a recent effort that just came out or is coming out shortly, we're looking at a variety of different recovery and research priorities where we can focus on. And we've done that in the past, and we keep doing that as we move forward and as those things might change. And so, for example, we might want to spend effort trying to maximize the prey abundance, availability, and quality. And then the next question becomes, well, how can you do that? Does that mean protecting spawning habitat for smelt and sand lance and herring, or what might we be able to do? Same thing for tufted puffins. When we listed it, we developed a recovery plan and looked at the factors causing the decline. Most of those seem to be climate change driven, so changes in ocean temperature in particular. But there were a variety of other factors we thought of as well, like human disturbance and others. And one thing we've noticed in particular is that as the ocean warms and we have very warm events come and hit our coast, then we seem to have these strong influences on the system. One of those events was known colloquially as the blob, and that occurred in 2014, 15, and 16. And we had very warm water. And during those events, we often have mortality events occurring in birds. So I borrowed a slide from Coast here. So this is the University of Washington Citizen Science Project, which monitors dead birds on the beaches in 4 states. Wonderful, well done citizen science. And what they're showing here in this image here is across time, the size of these bubbles is the size of mortality events that are occurring. So these are unusual mortality events. And then how does that relate to the sea surface temperature down here, where we're looking at the Chukchi Sea all the way down to California? And in general, we're seeing more of them occurring over time, and they seem to be disproportionately affecting alcids, so members of the auk family. You can see the rhino here, the puffin here, crested auklets here, murre, Cassin's auklet, common murre, puffins, rhinoceros auklet, murres, so that they seem to be disproportionately affected by these mortality events. And this really big one, the dot should be quite a bit bigger than that, perhaps twice as big. And that's the result of this most recent study here that came out in Science just recently with my colleagues up in Alaska, and Julia was on this paper, a variety of people were on this paper. And they reevaluated that mortality event, which occurred during the blob. And you can see where all the dead bodies occurred in terms of the dead murres. They now estimate over 1 million murres died in this event as a result of this heat wave. And what was most alarming to me is not only here was the population prior to the event, here's the event, and here's the population after. And what worries me most is this population is not recovering. So it's staying low after the event. And you can actually really see this. So if you look at the plates in their paper in Science, you can look at this murre colony, each one of these little dots that look like ants here. These are common murres on this cliff face. They're nesting here. They nest on the surface, on a flat surface like you see here, or in cracks. And this is what it looked like before the blob, and this is what it looked like after the blob, and what it would look like today as well. Well, when these events occur, there are winners and losers, or I should say winners and species that might hold their own. And one of them seems to be holding its own is the rhinoceros auklet. So our long-term work on rhinoceros auklet suggests that they're actually somewhat resilient during these marine heat waves. And remember, this is the auklet with a stable population, suggesting that it actually somehow is able to keep itself going and when things get bad. So a paper we published recently on that. In terms of recovery priorities, so what can we do about it? Well, obviously, it's really hard to do much at a local scale on global warming. Obviously, anything we can do is beneficial. But some of the local activities I'm focusing on are things like removing introduced rabbits from Destruction Island. This is a money that we're going for from the oil spill monies to remove the rabbit. European rabbits were introduced to Destruction Island in the late 1960s, early 1970s by the lighthouse keeper. They're still there today. And they're causing tremendous erosion on island. So if you visit the island, here's 2 images. And if you look at one spot while I'm standing literally on one spot. I can't remember if I took this picture, maybe Peter took this picture. So we're looking at one spot, and you can see the erosion occurring where the rabbits have been, and I can look over where it's a little bit off and detached, and you can see what the grass looks like. This literally looks like a putting green when you're on it. Actually, what I think a putting green looks like. I've never golfed on a golf course. I realized that. Huh. Maybe I should try that once. Anyway, you can see this erosion, and you can see this small, closely cropped grass, and the culprit that's responsible for it. And we're seeing that the annual grasses are perennial grasses that tend to be bunch grasses and hold the soil well are being replaced by annual grasses. So we'd like to remove the rabbits and then also do some revegetation. And where it's been studied in other parts of the world, in terms of the European rabbit, where they were looking at pink-footed shearwaters in Chile or Atlantic puffins in Iceland, or work that's been done on albatross and other species down in New Zealand and Australia, there's been real beneficial effects of removing the rabbits. And here's an exposure. You can see where you have rabbits and grazing, and you can see what happens to vegetation once you keep the rabbits out. The other thing we're doing is coming up doing research projects. This is a Alaska-led primarily effort. We're participating in it. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funded work, coming up with optimizing a range-wide monitoring program for tufted puffins that we're working on out of the University of Washington with Matt Farr and Sarah Converse. We're also trying introductions where we actually getting ready and trying different techniques. We're putting out decoys and nest boxes and see if they respond to those. We've had difficulty with bald eagles coming in and grabbing our decoys and pulling them out of the ground. Here's a decoy, and that long rod that was in the ground has been pulled out by this immature bald eagle. And we're continuing to do more research and try to understand what we can potentially do. And with that, I've been doing a lot of yakking. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. And also people a lot of times ask, what can I do? You can always participate in citizen science. These are 3 good examples in Washington and the Salish Sea you can participate in. There's the Salish Sea Guillemot Network, and that was just on local citizens on Whidbey Island starting this, and then now it's expanded to islands in South Sound and coastline in South Sound and all the way up by Discovery Bay and other locations. There's also the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, or COAST. That's a University of Washington-led effort. Dr. Julia Parrish started it. And another really nice example of citizen science done well. And I always call it the dead birds on the beach, but it gives us that important information, which I showed in that one slide, of when did these events occurring and what might be driving them. And then there's the Puget Sound Seabird Survey, which is done during the non-breeding season, so primarily fall through spring, and shore-based surveys that you can participate in, and that's being coordinated by the Puget Sound Bird Observatory. So with that, I'll try to answer some questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. I feel like I'm going to look at birds differently now. I'm going to be looking at so many more details, and this is great. If folks want to raise hands to ask questions, I can unmute you. We've also got some in the chat. So to kick things off, Scott, there was a lot of interest in the one fish versus multi-fish in beaks, and kind of the theory around why that might be. And also as part of that, like when birds are catching multiple, what that functionally looks like.
Yeah, really good question. Maybe I'll start with the latter part of that, particularly since I got the puffin open here in this image. I'm glad I kept it. This little spot right here, I don't know if people see this little fold here. And on an Atlantic puffin, it looks like a rosette. And it's called a rosette on the Atlantic puffin. Actually, I'm not sure what it's called generic or anatomically, but what it does is it allows the puffin, if you think about most birds, when they open their beak, they're going to open it this way, and it's hinged at the base. With that spot here in this extra tissue, what it does is allow the bird to open its beak straight up and down. I don't know if people are seeing my hand probably going in and out, right? But you're getting the idea. It'll go straight up and down. And what that does is, if you think about it, if it was going this way and you're trying to stack on a fish after fish after fish, you'd start losing the outside ones. And so that allows you to put pressure on all fish. The other thing is when you open the beak of this bird, I recommend you never do that or put your finger in it. It is incredibly painful. One person who helped us years ago with Marty Raphael, we were doing work on marbled murrelets on the outer coast and capturing birds at night. And we were trying to put some transmitters on tufted puffins. We caught a few and she was volunteering. She got bitten on the finger. And I think to this day, still can't feel that finger fully. So actually it resulted in some nerve damage. So they can bite. They've got an amazing amount of strength in their beak. And the last thing is up on the roof of their mouths, for the puffins, is a series of almost barbs that are pointed backwards. And those barbs help hold the fish in place. I still would love to see an image. I wish there was like a camera you could put on an animal like this and you could watch what they do. I'd love to see how they actually can just keep stacking on one after another. I find it fascinating. I find it hard to believe they can do it, but they do it. The one versus many. So the ones who can do many, the puffins, they'll adjust both the size and the number, and they do that based on the age of their chick. So when the chicks are small, they tend to be bringing back smaller fish. And as the chick gets big, they may bring back just one, and that'll be a big giant fish. So that's kind of the one versus many, and then both adults can bring back. And then there's a little bit of difference between the rhino and the puffin. The rhinos, because they're coming back at night, they can only deliver one bill load per night. And they tend to deliver around 32 grams of fish per night per adult, which is plenty. The tufted puffins, because they come back during the day, they can come back many times. And we see them delivering up to 5 bill loads per day. And sometimes I think the chick's going to explode because it's just hard to believe they can keep delivering fish and that chick will keep eating, but they do. And then the marble murrelet, in contrast, they tend to provision in the morning and the evening primarily, not exclusively, and they tend to bring just one fish. And that really limits how much food you can bring back to your chick. And so that it's really important that prey be of high quality, because you essentially have that one or those deliveries in the morning and the evening. So there's a big trade-off. We also look at the trade-off. For example, common murres are also bring back one fish. But because they're coming back to the colony during the day and many times, they can adjust how many trips they do in the day back and forth. So birds are trying to compensate how much calories and how much food they're delivering to their chicks in various different ways.
To hear both kind of how they adapt in that and are really mindful there. We also had a question, and this was earlier on, so you touched on some of the other stressors later, but can you reflect on just how nesting habitat, where that is in terms of stressor and limiting factor for the marbled murrelets?
It's hard to know. We're doing an effort right now, kind of a repeat of that. But when I showed you that hot spot and cold spot of the distribution along the coast for that marbled murrelet, and I showed the hot spot off of Oregon, we're doing some work on that right now. So Sierra Gilman is doing her PhD work, working with Beth Gardner and me. And essentially she's going to be doing some modeling. And that modeling will look at what affects the distribution and abundance of murrelets over time. And you can put in covariates into that model. And those covariates can be things like sea surface temperature. They can be the amount of nesting habitat and close proximity. It can be a variety of factors. And then you can look at the relative influence of those various variables on the movement or change in abundance. And I'm hoping that work will help provide some insights, because if it does, and those things are something we can have an effect on, that helps to prioritize conservation actions. So the relative influence is really hard to figure out. When we previously have done models, so from that paper I showed that image from, we found that the terrestrial environment had the largest impact relative to the marine. But what was interesting is that when we repeated the model just for the Puget Sound region, so different from the outer coast, and remember the Salish is a really different environment from So you think about that murrelet as being distributed, and we're looking at all the way down to Northern California and the California current system out here. Then there's this intermarine waters over here. And when we looked at that, we found that the marine factors had a much bigger effect for the Salish Sea than it did out here. So that, and one of the things that had a big influence was what we call the human marine footprint. And what was in that, if I remember right, we had a variety of things, including shipping traffic, the number of ports, a variety of things in terms of the population and the effects on the environment, suggesting that maybe some of those marine footprint signals may be having an influence.
It's always nice when we have models to kind of help play around with those stressors and tease it apart. And I think highlights, as you just mentioned, that it really depends on when and where you're looking in terms of the answer for some of those stressors. So thank you. We also have a question in the chat about common murres migrating into the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca after nesting in kind of the August to October time period. And if anyone has linked the murres that swim to the eastern Strait and Puget Sound to specific offshore nesting colonies, kind of getting at whether they're coming from Oregon or maybe further south.
Yeah. I don't know of any efforts to link directly that I can think of. There could, maybe somebody on the call can help. I know several people who are on have worked with murres more than I have. We do know that because the colonies are so big down in Oregon, that a lot of, when we see those dad chick pairs moving up the coast, when we see them moving up along our coast, and eventually some of them come into the intermarine waters, a lot of those are coming from Oregon colony, but we also have some sizable colonies on the Washington coast as well. So don't know for sure. The other thing is kind of fascinating about that, Natalie Hummel, for the PhD work, working with Julia, found that the murres would come in earlier and that we would see a lot more of them in intermarine waters in years where they did poorly. So we would see them coming in quite early. Or they just would just not breed.
That is really interesting. One of the other questions here is just similarly around common murres and recognizing that they're on that different limb of the family, as you highlighted at the start. Whether or not their diet and life habits that are so different from the others help to explain why they experience such a devastating loss during the blob?
It may have to do, I don't know. I wish I did know. Yeah, not sure. It may have been the proximity of those colonies, the food sources. I don't know, but it was pretty widespread throughout the Gulf of Alaska into the Aleutian area. So given that it was so widespread and the mortality was so widespread, it seemed to have had, why them in particular, I don't know. I should actually look at that most recent paper more carefully and see if it may be buried in there. I would guess maybe the discussion about why they thought the murre was so much affected. Yeah, not sure. It may have to do with, I've always thought, one thing I've thought about a lot with these birds is that they have a pretty high wing loading, which means it's really hard for them to fly. So the surface area relative to mass is low. And so as a result, they flap really fast. And that's a trade-off, which allows them also to fly underwater. And my guess is the wing loading is pretty different among these alcids. And I've always wondered if, and it's a test I wanted to do and a paper I wanted to work on, I just haven't had time to think about that wing loading and how it might be different among alcids, so you could control within family and look at how that might affect them. Don't know.
Fascinating. Well, we love highlighting research opportunities and uncertainties because, once you put the idea out there, it can spark connections. So fingers crossed on that for some future research. Jan, I see you have a question you'd like to ask. You should be able to unmute now. Maybe. Okay. In the meantime, I know, Scott, you highlighted a couple of the citizen science opportunities. Stuart's also asking how organizations like theirs, which is the Tahoma Bird Alliance, can meaningfully help on research for auks specifically.
Oh, good question. Probably would be the best through one of these already organized citizen science. It's hard to organize a new citizen science is tough. So citizen science done well is hard to do. And why is it hard to do? It's hard to do because it's hard to have a group of volunteers that are well trained and that are going to have sort of that care and feeding, if you will, that are needed to make them productive and also that have the information they need to do their job well. And also the management of that data and ultimately analysis of that data. And all of that's a challenge. And it's really hard to keep it going. No one wants to fund monitoring. We really find everyone wants to fund conservation actions, but nobody ever wants to fund monitoring. And so it makes it really hard to get these long-term data sets. And that's why, you know, anything anybody can do to help think about how to do that would be helpful, because almost always somebody wants to fund a conservation action, which you can understand, right? That's a sexy thing. It's something that shows that we're taking action. We're actually moving the dial on conservation. But without the monitoring, we have no idea whether we're successful. We have no idea what the problems are. We don't understand the distribution of the birds. We don't know all kinds of things. And so the action without that, without both of them going hand in hand, we also don't know whether it was effective, the conservation actions. So they need to go together. So anything we can do to participate more broadly with projects that are already up and running, that would be great. Gosh, beyond that, I can't think of any other actions at the moment, but I'll keep thinking about it.
Thanks, Scott. And I appreciate.
Yeah, there might be times where I need people to go through data. So that's something to think about, but I need to set that up well. For example, I think for now we have it set, but when we put out the decoys in the boxes, we had thousands of images. Well, it'd be nice if AI would do it. AI can do it to some degree, and we do use AI, but AI is tough, and AI is not where everybody thinks it is today. AI often, so I'm talking about artificial intelligence, and those algorithms require training data. And that training data means that you need to show an image where everything is appropriately tagged on it. And then you need to show it, essentially show it, I'm speaking loosely here, but show it to the algorithm and keep training that algorithm until it gets better and better and better. And people don't realize that it may take many thousands of images. And that's a lot of work to tag them. AI can be particularly helpful sometimes in just identifying images with something and without something. But also, if you think about birds, they're complicated depending on which angle they're facing, whether the wings out or in, and it becomes really difficult, even for something you think is being pretty distinct looking. So AI is not really where everyone thinks it is, but you know, it's getting there. It's improving.
Thanks, Scott.
I think I'm muted.
Yes,
Oh.
I was going to say, Jan, I think you're unmuted if you want to close us out with a final question.
Thank you. I was having a lot of trouble there figuring out how to raise my hand and never did find anything. I've been doing a lot of donating of time on environmental issues, and one of the things I've spent some time looking at is the marbled murrelet issue in Puget Sound. And numbers I'm seeing are things like over 10 years, the marbled murrelet numbers have dropped 17% in Hood Canal. Then I've also seen numbers that show, I think this was 2023, that the numbers are down in all of Washington state about 4%. The numbers are up in California 3.8%, which is wonderful. And they're up 1.8% in Oregon. So then you have to ask, well, what's the difference? And you see research showing that they now think that one of the problems with nest failure in Washington isn't just the fact of that there's a problem finding a nest. It may in fact be more tuned into the lack of prey. And the elephant in the room that no one seems to tune in on, you look at research reports, it's rarely mentioned, is 30% or more of all of Puget Sound tidelands are under permit for aquatic shellfish farming, commercial shellfish farming. And the destruction in the tidelands is just unbelievable. So you see a lot of things like marble murrelet numbers going down, Chinook salmon numbers are dropping like a rock, and they all depend on forage fish and other organisms in those tidelands and in the waters of Puget Sound. Is anybody looking at that?
I would guess there are people working on that. I don't know who offhand is looking at the interaction between shell fisheries and forage fish spawning habitat. But I would guess there's actually a fair amount of work on that. But I don't know offhand who could point you towards. If somebody online has can point to some research, that would be super helpful.
Well, I've seen absolutely nothing. So hopefully there's something.
Yeah, some on that, but I guess maybe not a lot. In terms of the declines of the murrelet that you mentioned, the 4% decline or 4.6% decline or whatever it was in the murrelet, that's an annual decline.
Right.
So that's a rate of decline. I just want to emphasize that the way you worded it was there's been a 4% decline. No, the decline in the Salish Sea is over half.
Correct. Yeah.
Whereas the decline is around 4%. So the Hook Canal study, I'm not sure which one you were pointing to, maybe the one I published for the winter time. And that involved those strata that I mentioned. So Central Puget Sound, Hook Canal, Admiralty Inlet, Whidbey Basin. And those were percent changes between the beginning of the work and the end of the work.
Yeah, that was a Lance paper in 2021, I believe. And that was from 2012 to 2020.
Yeah, appreciate the discussion on some of these trends and the importance of those compounding rates over time of decline. I know we are at a couple minutes over here, but appreciate the robust interest and discussion. Certainly, if anyone thinks of some of the connections there on research with shellfish and forage fish, feel free to email and I will connect dots. But appreciate everyone's time to connect today, to dig into some of the science and the patterns so that we do have an understanding of a better understanding what trends are and where the needs are. So thank you, Scott, for sharing a wealth of information as well as some very breathtaking photos.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. Bye.